Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/BrianEDenton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 190. Chapter 190. Bald Hills, Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky's estate, lay 40 miles east from Smolensk and 2 miles from the main road to Moscow. The same evening that the prince gave his instructions to Alpatych, Dessau, having asked to see Princess Mary, told her that, as the prince was not very well and was taking no steps to secure his safety, though from Prince Andrew's letter it was evident that to remain at Bald Hills might be dangerous, he respectfully advised her to send a letter by Alpatych to the provincial governor at Smolensk, asking him to let her know the state of affairs and the extent of the danger to which Bald Hills was exposed. Dessau wrote this letter to the governor for Princess Mary. She signed it, and it was given to Alpatych with instructions to hand it to the governor and to come back as quickly as possible if there were danger. Having received all his orders, Alpatych, wearing a white beaver hat, a present from the prince, and carrying a stick, as the prince did, went out accompanied by his family. 3 well-fed roans stood ready harnessed to a small conveyance with a leather hood. The larger bell was muffled, and the little bells on the harness stuffed with paper. The prince allowed no one at Bald Hills to drive with ringing bells, but on a long journey Alpatych liked to have them. His satellites, the senior clerk, a counting-house clerk, a scullery maid, a cook, 2 old women, a little page boy, the coachman, and various domestic serfs, were seeing him off. His daughter placed chintz-covered down cushions for him to sit on and behind his back. His old sister-in-law popped in a small bundle, and one of the coachmen helped him into the vehicle. There, woman's fuss, women, said Alpatych, puffing and speaking rapidly, just as the prince did, and he climbed into the trap. After giving the clerk orders about the work to be done, Alpatych, not trying to imitate the prince now, lined the hat from his bald head and crossed himself 3 times. "If there is anything, come back, Yakov Alpatych. For Christ's sake, think of us," cried his wife, referring to the rumors of war and to the enemy. Women's fuss," muttered Alpatych to himself, and started on his journey, looking round at the fields of yellow rye and the still green, thickly growing oats, and at another quite black fields just being ploughed a second time. As he went along, he looked with pleasure at the year's splendid crop of corn, scrutinized the strips of rye field, which here and there were already being reaped, made his calculations as to the sowing and the harvest, and asked himself whether he had not forgotten any of the prince's orders. Having baited the horses twice on the way, he arrived at the town toward evening of the 4th of August. Alpatych kept meeting and overtaking baggage trains and troops on the road. As he approached Smolensk, he heard the sound of distant firing, but those did not impress him. What struck him most was the sight of a splendid field of oats, in which a camp had been pitched, and which was being mown down by the soldiers, evidently for fodder. This fact impressed Alpatych, but in thinking about his own business he soon forgot it. All the interest of his life for more than 30 years had been bound up by the will of the prince, and he never went beyond that limit. Everything not connected with the execution of the prince's orders did not interest and did not even exist for Alpatych. On reaching Smolensk on the evening of the 4th of August, he put in at the Gatchina suburb across the Dnieper, at the inn kept by Ferapantov, where he had been in the habit of putting up for the last 30 years. Some 30 years ago, Ferapantov, by Alpatich's advice, had bought a wood from the prince, had begun to trade, and now had a house, an inn, and a corn dealer's shop in that province. He was a stout, dark, red-faced peasant in the 40s, with thick lips, a broad knob of a nose, similar knobs over his black frowning brows, and a round belly. Wearing a waistcoat over his cotton shirt, Ferapentov was standing before his shop, which opened onto the street. On seeing Alpatych, he went up to him. "You're welcome, Yakov Alpatych. Folks are leaving the town, but you have come into it," said he. "Why are they leaving the town?" asked Alpatych. "That's what I say. Folks are foolish, always afraid of the French." Women's fuss, said Alpatych. "Just what I think, Alpatych. What I say is, orders have been given not to let them in, so that must be right. And the peasants are asking 3 rubles for carting. It isn't Christian." Yakov Alpatych heard without heeding. He asked for a samovar and for hay for his horses, and when he had his tea he went to bed. All night long troops were moving past the inn. Next morning Alpatych donned a jacket he wore only in town and went out on business. It was a sunny morning, and by 8 o'clock it was already hot. A good day for harvesting, thought Alpatych. From beyond the town firing had been heard since early morning. At 8 o'clock the booming of cannon was added to the sound of musketry. Many people were hurrying through the streets, and there were many soldiers, but cabs were still driving about. Tradesmen stood at their shops, and service was being held in the churches as usual. Alpatych went to the shops, to the government offices, to the post office, and to the governor's. In the offices and shops and at the post office, everyone was talking about the army, and about the enemy who was already attacking the town. Everybody was asking what should be done, and all were trying to calm one another. In front of the governor's house, Alpatych found a large number of people, Cossacks, and a traveling carriage of the governor's. At the porch he met 2 of the landed gentry, one of whom he knew. This man, an ex-captain of police, was saying angrily, "It's no joke, you know. It's all very well if you're single. One man, though, is undone, as the proverb says. But with 13 in your family and all the property, they've brought us to utter ruin. What sort of governors are they that do that? They ought to be hanged, the brigands." "Oh, come, that's enough," said the other. "What do I care? Let him hear. We're not dogs," said the ex-captain of police, and looking around, he noticed Alpatych. "Oh, Yakov Alpatych, what have you come for?" "To see the governor by his excellency's orders," answered Alpatych, lifting his head and proudly thrusting his hand into the bosom of his coat, and as he always did when he mentioned the prince. "He has ordered me to inquire into the position of affairs," he added. "Yes, go and find out," shouted the angry gentleman. "They've brought things to such a pass that there are no carts or anything. There it is again, do you hear?" said he, pointing in the direction whence the sounds came of the firing. "They've brought us all to ruin, the brigands," he repeated, and descended the porch steps. Alpatych swayed his head and went upstairs. In the waiting room were tradesmen, women, and officials, looking silently at one another. The door of the governor's room opened, and they all rose and moved forward. An official ran out. Some said words to a merchant, called a stout official with the cross hanging on his neck to follow him, and vanished again, evidently wishing to avoid the inquiring looks and questions addressed to him. Alpatych moved forward, and next time the official came out, addressed him, one hand placed in the breast of his buttoned coat, and handed him 2 letters. "To his honor, Baron Ash, from General-in-Chief Prince Bolkonsky," he announced, with such solemnity and significance that the official turned to him and took the letters. A few minutes later the governor received Alpatych and hurriedly said to him, "Inform the prince and princess that I knew nothing. I acted in the highest instructions. Here." And he handed a paper to Alpatych. "Still, as the prince is unwell, my advice is that they should go to Moscow. I'm just starting myself. Inform them." But the governor did not finish. A dusty, perspiring officer ran into the room and began to say something in French. The governor's face expressed terror. "Go," he said, nodding his head to Alpatych, and began questioning the officer. Eager, frightened, helpless glances were turned on Alpatych when he came out of the governor's room. Involuntarily listening now to the firing, which had drawn nearer, and was increasing in strength, Alpatych hurried to his inn. The paper handed to him by the governor said this: "I assure you that the town of Smolensk is not in the slightest danger as yet, and it is unlikely that it will be threatened with any. I from the one side and Prince Bagration from the other are marching to unite our forces before Smolensk, which junction will be effected on the 22nd instant, and both armies with the united forces will defend our compatriots of the province entrusted to your care till our efforts shall be beaten back by the enemies of our fatherland, and till the last warrior in our valiant ranks have perished. From this you will see that you have a perfect right to reassure the inhabitants of Smolensk, for those defended by 2 such brave armies may feel assured of victory, Instructions from Barclay de Tolly to Baron Ash, the civil governor of Smolensk, 1812. People were anxiously roaming about the streets. Carts piled high with household utensils, chairs, and cupboards kept emerging from the gates of the yards and moving along the streets. Loaded carts stood at the house next to Ferampitov's, and women were wailing and lamenting as they said goodbye. A small watchdog ran around barking in front of the harnessed horses. Alpatych entered the inn-yard at a quicker pace than usual and went straight to the shed where his horses and trap were. The coachman was asleep. He woke him up, told him to harness, and went into the passage. From the host's room came the sounds of a child crying, the despairing sobs of a woman, and the hoarse, angry shouting of Ferampintov. The cook began running hither and thither in the passage like a frightened hen, just as Alpatych entered. "He's done her to death, killed the mistress, beat her, dragged her about so." "What for?" said Alpatych. "She kept begging to go away. She's a woman. 'Take me away,' says she. 'Don't let me perish with my little children. Folks,' she said, 'are all gone. So why,' she says, 'don't we go?' And he began beating and pulling her about so." At these words, Alpatych nodded as if in approval, and not wishing to hear more, went to the door of the room opposite the innkeeper's, where he had left his purchases. "You brute! You murderer!" screamed a thin, pale woman, who, with a baby in her arms, and her kerchief torn from her head, burst through the door at the moment and down the steps into the yard. Ferampintov came out after her, but on seeing Alpatych, adjusted his waistcoat, smoothed his hair, yawned, and followed Alpatych into the opposite room. "Going already?" said he. Alpatych, without answering or looking at his host, sorted his packages and asked how much he owed. "Well, reckon up. Well, have you been to the governor's?" asked Ferampintov. "What has been decided?" Alpatych replied that the governor had not told him anything definite. "With our business, how can we get away?" said Ferampintov. "We have to pay 7 rubles a cartload to Dorogovich, and then I tell them they're not Christians at it. Selivanov, now, did a good stroke last Thursday, sold flour to the army at 9 rubles a sack. Will you have some tea?" he added. While the horses were being harnessed, Alpatych and Ferampintov, over their tea, talked of the price of corn, the crops, and the good weather for harvesting. "Well, it seems to be getting quieter," remarked Ferampintov, finishing his 3rd cup of tea and getting up. "Ours must have got the best of it. The orders were not to let them in, so we're in force, it seems. They say only the other day Matthew Ivanitch Platov drove them into the river Marina and drowned some 8,000 in one day." Alpatych collected his parcels, handed them to the coachman who came in, and settled up with the innkeeper. The noise of wheels, hooves, and bells was heard from the gateway as the little trap passed out. It was by now late in the afternoon. Half the street was in shadow, and the other half brightly lit by the sun. Alpatych looked out of the window and went to the door. Suddenly, the strange sound of a far-off whistle and a thud was heard, followed by a boom of cannon, blending into the dull roar that set the windows rattling. He went out into the streets. 2 men were running past towards the bridge. From different sides came whistling sounds and the thud of cannonballs and bursting shells falling on the town. But these sounds were hardly heard in comparison with the noise of the firing outside the town, and attracted little attention from the inhabitants. The town was being bombarded by 130 guns, which Napoleon had ordered up at 4 o'clock. The people did not at once realize the meaning of this bombardment. At first, the noise of the falling bombs and shells only aroused curiosity. Ferapintov's wife, who till then had not ceased wailing under the shed, became quiet, and with the baby in her arms, went out to the gate, listening to the sounds and looking in silence at the people. The cook and a shop assistant came to the gate. With lively curiosity, everyone tried to get a glimpse of the projectiles as they flew over their heads. Several people came round the corner, talking eagerly. "What force!" remarked one. "Knocked the roof off the ceiling, all to splinters." "Routed up the earth like a pig," said another. "That's grand, it bucks one up," laughed the first. "Lucky you jumped aside, or it would have wiped you out." Others joined those men, and stopped and told how cannonballs had fallen on a house close to them. Meanwhile, still more projectiles, now with the swift, sinister whistle of a cannonball, now with the agreeable, intermittent whistle of a shell, flew over people's heads incessantly. But not one fell close by. They all flew over. Alpatych was getting into his trap. The innkeeper stood at the gate. "What are you staring at?" he shouted to the cook, who in her red skirt, with sleeves rolled up, swinging her bare elbows, had stepped into the corner to listen to what was being said. "What marvels!" she exclaimed. But hearing her master's voice, she turned back, pulling down her tucked-up skirt. Once more something whistled, but this time quite close, swooping downward like a little bird. A flame flashed in the middle of the street, something exploded, and the street was shrouded in smoke. "Scoundrel, what are you doing?" shouted the innkeeper, rushing to the cook. At that moment, the pitiful wailing of women was heard from different sides. The frightened baby began to cry, and people crowded silently with pale faces round the cook. The loudest sound in the crowd was her wailing. "Oh, dear souls, dear kind souls, don't let me die, my good souls." 5 minutes later, no one remained in the street. The cook, with her thigh broken by a shell splintered, had been carried into the kitchen. Alpatych, his coachman, Ferapontov's wife and children, and the house porter were all sitting in the cellar listening. The roar of guns, the whistling of projectiles, and the piteous moaning of the cook, which rose above the other sounds, did not cease for a moment. The mistress rocked and hushed her baby, and when anyone came into the cellar asked in a pathetic whisper what had become of her husband, who had remained in the street. A shopman who entered told her that her husband had gone with others to the cathedral, whence they were fetching the wonder-working icon of Smolensk. Towards dusk, the cannonade began to subside. Alpatych left the cellar and stopped in the doorway. The evening sky that had been so clear was clouded with smoke, through which, high up, the sickle of the new moon shone strangely. Now that terrible din of the guns had ceased, a hush seemed to reign over the town, broken only by the rustle of footsteps, the moaning, the distant cries, and the cackle of fires, which seemed widespread everywhere. The cook's moans had now subsided. On two sides, black curling clouds of smoke rose and spread from the fires. Through the streets, soldiers in various uniforms walked or ran confusedly in different directions like ants from a ruined anthill. Several of them ran into Ferapontov's yard before Alpatich's eyes. Alpatych went to the gate. A retreating regiment, thronging and hurrying, blocked the street. Noticing him, an officer said, "The town is being abandoned. Get away, get away." And then turning to the soldiers, shouted, "I'll teach you to run in the yards." Alpatych went back to the house, called the coachman, and told him to set off. Ferapontov's whole household came out too, following Alpatych and the coachman. The women, who had been silent till then, suddenly began to wail as they looked at the fires, the smoke, and even the flames of which could be seen in the failing twilight. And, as if in reply, the same kind of lamentation was heard from other parts of the street. Inside the shed, Alpatych and the coachman arranged the tangled reins and traces of their horses with trembling hands. As Alpatych was driving out of the gate, he saw some 10 soldiers in Ferapontov's open shop, talking loudly and filling their bags and knapsacks with flour and sunflower seeds. Just then, Ferapontov returned and entered his shop. On seeing the soldiers, he was about to shout at them, but suddenly stopped, and clutching at his hair, burst into sobs and laughter. "Loot everything, lads. Don't let those devils get it," he cried, taking some bags of flour himself and throwing them into the street. Some of the soldiers were frightened and ran away. Others went on filling their bags. On seeing Alpatych, Ferapontov turned to him. "Russia is done for," he cried. "Alpatych, I'll set the place on fire myself. We're done for." And Ferapontov ran into the yard. Soldiers were passing in a constant stream along the street, blocking it completely, so that Alpatych could not pass out and had to wait. Ferapontov's wife and children were also sitting in a car, waiting till it was possible to drive out. Night had come. There were stars in the sky, and the new moon shone out amid the smoke that screened it. On the sloping descent to the Dnieper, Alpatich's cart and that of the innkeeper's wife, which were slowly moving amid the rows of soldiers and of the other vehicles, had to stop. In a side street near the crossroads where the vehicles had stopped, a house and some shops were on fire. This fire was already burning itself out. The flames now died down and were lost in the black smoke, now suddenly flared up again brightly, lighting up with strange distinctness the faces of the people crowding at the crossroads. Black figures flitted about the fire, and through the incessant crackling of the flames, talking and shouting could be heard. Seeing that his trap would not be able to move on for some time, Alpatych got down and turned into the side street to look at the fire. Soldiers were continually rushing backwards and forwards near it, and he saw 2 of them, and a man in a frieze coat dragging burning beams into another yard across the street, while others carried bundles of hay. Alpatych went up to a large crowd standing before a high barn which was blazing briskly. The walls were all on fire, and a black wall had fallen in. The wooden roof was collapsing, and the rafters were alight. The crowd was evidently watching and waiting for the roof to fall in. and Alpatich watched and waited for it too. "Alpatich!" a familiar voice suddenly hailed the old man. "Mercy on us, your excellency," answered Alpatich, immediately recognizing the voice of his young prince. Prince Andrew, in his riding cloak, mounted on a black horse, was looking at Alpatich from the back of the crowd. "Why are you here?" he asked. Your excellency," stammered Alpatich and broke into sobs. "Are we really lost? Master!" "Why are you here?" Prince Andrew repeated. At that moment the flames flared up and showed his young master's pale, worn face. Alpatich told how he had been sent there and how difficult it was to get away. "Are we really quite lost, your excellency?" he asked again. Prince Andrew, without replying, took out a notebook and, raising his knee, began writing in pencil on a page he tore out. He wrote to his sister, "Smolensk is being abandoned. Bald Hills will be occupied by the enemy within a week. Set off immediately for Moscow. Let me know at once when you will start. Send by special messenger to Ushav." Having written this and given the paper to Alpatich, he now told him to arrange for departure of the prince, the princess, his son, and the boy's tutor, and how and where to let him know immediately. Before he had time to finish giving these instructions, a chief of staff, followed by a suite, galloped up to him. "You are a colonel?" shouted the chief of staff with a German accent, in a voice familiar to Prince Andrew. "Houses are set on fire in your presence, and you stand by? What does this mean?" "You will answer for it," shouted Berg, who was now assistant to the chief of staff of the left flank of the infantry of the First Army, a place, as Berg said, very agreeable and well en evidence. Prince Andrew looked at him and without replying went on speaking to Alpatich. "So tell them that I shall await a reply till the 10th, and if by the 10th I don't receive news that they have gone away, I shall have to throw up everything and come myself to Bald Hills." "Prince," said Berg, recognizing Prince Andrew, "I only spoke because I have to obey orders, because I always do obey exactly. You must excuse me," he went on apologetically. Something cracked in the flames. The fire died down for a moment, and wreaths of black smoke rolled up from under the roof. There was another terrible crash, and something huge collapsed. "Oh! Oh!" yelled the crowd, echoing the crash of the collapsing roof of the barn, the burning grain in which diffused a cake-like aroma all around. The flames flared up again, lighting the animated, delighted, exhausted faces of the spectators. The man in the frieze coat raised his arms and shouted, "It's fine, lads. Now it's raging. It's fine." "That's the owner himself," cried several voices. "Well then," continued Prince Andrew to Alpatich, "report to them as I have told you." And not replying a word to Berg, who was now mute beside him, he touched his horse and rode down the street. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 190. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 190. Smolensk Tried by Fire. This chapter puts the war into War and Peace. It's a deeply visceral triumph of transportive storytelling. We are truly with Alpatich as he negotiates war-torn Smolensk. We're with him as he first enters the town, marveling at soldiers mowing down a perfectly good oat field for fodder as enemy cannon fire cracks in the distance. We're with him in the darkness of night, as marching soldiers beat a foreboding clangor just outside his window. We're with him later as the whistling roar and booming thuds of cannon shelling rains down upon the town, filling the fleeing streets with ghostly smoke, demon fire, and the terrified wailing of women and children. And then the panic of fearful uncertainty as Prince Andrew's wraith-like apparition emerges on horseback, illuminated by the greedy flames of wrack and ruin. Despite all this danger, Alpatich fulfills his duty. He executes the old prince's orders and delivers Dessau's message to the provincial governor. It's a tough order to fill, but he does so with grace and grit. He even takes tea with an old friend as the war closes in on Smolensk. There's something profoundly honorable in his service to the old prince here. His unflinching courage and dedication to the task at hand, even while under attack from an invading foreign army, provides a forceful example of endurance of spirit in the face of adversity. Remember Alpatich and his taking of tea amid the Battle of Smolensk the next time you encounter hardship. Daily Meditation. Gold is tried by fire, brave men by calamities. Seneca on Providence. All right, so that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 190. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening with me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 191. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.